Buenos días. Gracias por venir. Sorry because I had to move to English because you know this is an English session. So thank you for coming to this session. I hope you enjoy a lot yesterday dinner. It was really fine. So yeah, for sure. The dance was special. Yeah. So thank you for coming, especially Friday morning. And today we have a really amazing presentation about one of the topics that we have been discussing these days, is the issue of international reference pricing. As a member of the scientific committee and also as a professor here in Andalusian School of Public Health, I'm very proud to have here in the school, three of the persons that have been working a lot on the topic that we are discussing today. Probably we are missing Patricia Danson, that's another person that have been working a lot in this topic. So, but Panos Canavos, Adrian, and John Rovira have been one of the topics that they have been working a lot. So, again, thank you for coming. I think I don't need to introduce Panos or Adrian or Rovira, but I will do. So, Panos Canavos, he's professor in London School of Economics. He has been working in pharmaceutical policy, parallel trade, and so on during the last. He's very young, but probably has been working the last 20 years. And so on. He has been also working like advisor for several international organizations like WHO, European Commission, and so on. We have been working together a lot with European Commission, and so on. We have many papers together. Adrian Toll, he's Director Office of Health Economics in London. During the last few years, you have been also publishing a lot with Patricia Danson and so on about international reference pricing, differential pricing. So this is the topic that Adrian is going to speak today. Finally, John Rovira, you know him very well. He's one of the founders of the Spanish Health Economics Association, and he's professor in Barcelona University and also in Andalusian School of Public Health. So they are going to speak like half an hour. At the final time of the presentation, we are going to have like debate will be at the end, so you can make the question clarification at the end of the session. So it will be half an hour any of the time of the speaker, and then half an hour of discussion. So again, thank you for coming this morning. The first speaker will be John Rovira, that he's going to give a general introduction about what is international reference pricing, what are the theories that are behind that, and what are the different experience that we have. Thank you, John.
Well, good morning. I think that we have deserved also a coffee, not just so many thanks for coming, etc. I think everyone who's here and who's stayed yesterday until 3 o'clock deserves a coffee, but we don't have a coffee. No? Okay, so we'll have to go on, please. If you sleep, don't snore, etc. Okay, so I was asked to make a kind of introduction to the topic of the differential pricing, and so I decided that I would review the different definitions and theories, and I found it a little boring, so finally I made also some comments and proposals, because looking at definitions and underlying theory it's important to set the framework for a debate, but it's not that exciting. So let's start. Okay. So as here I mentioned, differential pricing is quite inconvenient to be looking. So I rather will be using this one, but there is not a micro to talk. Oh, I see, it's here, so sorry. No, don't worry. I have your on the screen. So the idea is that there are a lot of debates on differential pricing and related concepts, and the idea is that it's not always well defined what is meant. You will see the different and similar terms, and it's not clear what it's meant. So this is why one of the things I will try to sort out what is meant by equity pricing, tiered pricing, differential pricing, discriminatory pricing, because are very related concepts. So we will try to discuss these meanings, different meanings, then briefly review the theory or underlying assumptions behind every of these meanings, then assess a little bit the evidence that we have or we can have on differential pricing, and at the end, as I say, I will make some comments and one proposal. So differential pricing or preferential pricing, sometimes higher pricing, it can be defined as a strategy or a practice whereby a good is priced at different prices across markets or across consumer goods. Usually when people speak about differential pricing, they mean some kind of voluntary practice, not a kind of enforced or regulated structure. And then in principle, some people seem to mean that if they say differential pricing, prices are somehow correlated to the purchasing power or to income of the consumer or of the group or the buyer. And as I say, there are similar terms, and this is the first task to try to find out. By the way, here when I speak here of prices, I will mean transaction prices, net of discounts, because very often you see people talking about prices but referring to this official list or catalog prices, which are not real economic prices, because it's not a transaction, but it's rather kind of maximum or intended or hypothetical price. And so if at some point of time I say price, means real price, cost, opportunity cost price. Then equity pricing, it's just kind of different modality, which in my view, after reviewing different authors, many authors, they start speaking about with one of these concepts and then do not spend much time trying to precisely define why they use this or the other concept. So you have to find out from the context what they mean. And usually pricing is more a kind of normative concept that refers again to practices or strategies or sometimes agreements. And again, as in the previous case, where the price is related to the purchasing power or to the income, to some indicator of welfare. But usually people that speak with these terms means something more regulated, more transparent, whereas the first concept, differential pricing, usually means a practice carried out by a company, voluntarily says, well, I set different prices because I don't know, for corporate social responsibility or whatever. And equity pricing is more apparently used by people that means something more transparent, organized. No? Actually, I saw a very funny, also a very funny definition of equity pricing by the FPMA, so the International Association of Pharmaceutical Manufacturers. And they have also a kind of glossary in one paper. And equity pricing says, well, this is a concept used by activists, says, and probably they say not very clear or not very useful, or really they dismiss, no, because they don't like equity pricing, no, apparently because of this feeling of equity or whatever behind. Discriminatory pricing, this is a term which is better established, no? If you have, if you are an economist and you have studied macroeconomic theory, you probably it's the kind of term you are exposed to, no? Discriminatory pricing is supposed to be a positive concept in economic theory, which means that a monopolist, usually a monopolist, has the power to segment the markets, to take a market and make different sub-markets or groups, no, which are independent, cannot sell and make any arbitrage. And then the monopolist then has the possibility of setting a different price in each subgroup that maximizes the profits in this group. So at the end, with this strategy, the monopolist can maximize the global profits. And certainly, with this strategy, the idea is that the monopolists can get higher global profits that if charging a single price across all segments or markets. I will not go into formula, but the idea is that in order to attain this maximum profit, the level of price is related to the inversely related to the price elasticity of the demand of each submarket. Then there is a new, or not new, is quite old, but a similar concept, Ramsey pricing, and this originally was a regulatory type of pricing policy. The idea is if you have a public utility, I don't know, for gas or water or whatever, and this is a public one, and it does not intend to maximize profits, but still it can consider that the marginal costs are very low, and then they set a kind of different price whereby they can recover fixed cost and also the marginal cost. And then again, the submarket prices, they are related to the price elasticity plus constant, because if they charge only the marginal cost as a price, then they would not be able to recover the fixed cost. And one can say that under certain quite restrictive conditions, Ramsey pricing may give the same or a similar price than equity pricing. That probably, in some cases, but not always, the price with this approach is the same that if you, in a normative way, set the price according or somehow proportional to the income or to the purchasing power. So what is a little bit very brief and not very technical theoretical framework behind all this idea of differential pricing? Well, as you know, if you are an economist, probably, if not, you will know at the end of the presentation, if in the theoretical model of a competitive market, where there is no regulation, the goods are homogeneous and some other perfect information, blah, 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 then the idea is that a single price will prevail, because no consumers are not stupid, and so if you know all the prices and you try to get the best value for money, you will, and all the goods are homogeneous, you are not going to pay more for one good if there is another, seller offering the same good at a lower price. So at the end, if any seller would like to sell at a higher price, he or she, and he would not sell any unit. So this is the idea behind having, in the theoretical model at least, a single price in a competitive market at equilibrium. But in practice, then there are departures, because price differences can, in practice, sometimes also in theory, but certainly in practice. So differences can appear as a result of cost-related differences. For instance, if you have to transport the good to some more distant place, even if there are no barriers, no restrictions, probably the cost would be higher. Or if you have some differences in the conditions of the transactions, if I have to sell something to Jaime or to Panos, I know Panos never pays in time, it will take 2 months, and I will have to go, so I will charge, just in case, a higher price. And so we have this kind of differences which are, so to say, justified, and we wouldn't call this differential pricing or discriminatory pricing. It's more, there are differences related to the fact that it's not a exactly competitive market, what we have in that case. And we have also a model which acknowledges, a theoretical model acknowledges price differences, what we call monopolistic competition, and this happens, this requires to have the possibility of product differentiation. Product differentiation does not mean that two products or the products of two companies are different in a physical term or whatever, but just that the manufacturers are clever enough to make us think that a certain product is better than another one. No? Because they can just sow a crocodile here, and then we're prepared to pay, I don't know, $20 more for the same T-shirt. No? Well, at least here will be a small cost of crocodile. No? But anyway, the idea of monopolistic competition is the quality is the same, but just the consumers have the perception, you know, which is, of course, produced by advertising and by marketing techniques, that you know, there is some value attached to a certain product or certain manufacturer, and this is what they call brand loyalty. Although price differences, which are based on quality, you know, should not be considered as a kind of differential pricing, sometimes you find the two different causes of price differentiation. So you can find some cases that you have a brand loyalty for a certain brand just because it has been advertised and they have convinced you that you will be stronger and you will attract women with this, you know, whatever, no, with this shirt, or but then there can also this be coincident with a real difference, no? And then all the models becomes more complex to understand, no? Because they are not pure, so it's combination of them. No? Well, then under the monopoly, and monopoly can be the result, not always, but can be the result of patents or other exclusive marketing rights. Then, in principle, also a single, the theoretical, you know, model tells us that a single price will prevail. No? In principle, having a monopoly does not mean that it will be always the possibility of having different prices. Only in certain circumstances, as I mentioned before, if the monopolist is able to separate several sub-markets and avoid having the consumer selling from one segment to the other, what we call arbitration. No? So, and you have somehow to find a way, a legal or a physical or some way to avoid one guy in one market that gets a low price to go to someone from another segment where the monopolist wants to charge or tries to charge a higher price and sell the good to a kind of intermediate price. No? With arbitration would, if it happens, then will turn a kind of segmented market into a single market. Usually the monopolist is interested in charging different prices. We can assume, if we accept that profit maximization is the best or the only or whatever objective of a company in a free market system, we can think that this can be done for profit maximization profits, but it's true that it could also be done for other purposes. No? For instance, if a company has humanitarian feelings, if a company care for the poor or whatever, they can charge this. In some cases, it's not clear. Maybe this is kind of image. Say, well, this is good for the profits. No, if you look humanitarian, then you will have, you know, more goodwill from the consumers. But in principle, this is very difficult to know exactly what is the real cause. No, you can maybe believe what the company tells you, but certainly in usually theory thinks about the profit maximization motive as the most important motive to explain why a monopolist turns out to be a discriminant monopolist. So the idea is that if the monopolist can segment the market, it will set different prices and then has a larger profit. And there are some, here I found sometimes some more precise definitions. For instance, Stigler makes this, the idea is that a firm price discriminates when the ratio of prices is different from the ratio of marginal cost for two goods. So in some cases, some authors try to make some more formal definitions. In other cases, that is not so. No, when I started speaking about differential pricing, active pricing. I have not found any accepted definition, a global definition, but in that case there is. No? Again, about this other concept of discrimination, I found that it was Pigou that first introduced, at least, I don't know if discrimination, but at least these three categories of price discrimination, the first, second, and third. Usually the one that we will use later is the third degree price discrimination. The idea is first, the first degree, no, third degree is the one which is most relevant. The first degree or primary, it assumes that the monopolist can discriminate each consumer. So it's setting potentially a different price for each person, no? Just like personalized medicine, so it's personalized pricing. And so the monopolist could extract the maximum value, so to say, from this market for him as income. This is the idea of first degree price discrimination. This is just a theoretical model. It's very difficult to see this happen in practice. One can think about some examples. For instance, doctors in the past, you know, when you went to visit a doctor, a private doctor, they was able to charge more or less whatever he or she wanted, no? And it was supposed to charge you according if you are well dressed and if you look more wealthy, no? So there may be some examples, but it's not so relevant. The second degree price discrimination, this is, I think, a more contentious concept. It's supposed to be when the monopolist discriminates according to the quantity demanded. So if you are a big buyer, you get usually a lower price. But whether this is real discrimination or is because there are some, you know, externalities, you know, if you sell in bulk, then there are some fixed cost in the transaction. So maybe, you know, one can think that this is not pure discrimination, but just a cost issue. No? But again, this is what Pigou proposed some time ago, and then usually this is repeated for years and years. And then the more relevant in practice type of price discrimination is the third degree, and this is supposed to mean charging different prices to different groups or countries or groups within a country. No? Usually the prices are possibly related to the income or to purchasing capacity. Again, it's related to, as with other similar models, with the inverse of the inverse of elasticity of demand. No? The idea is that this, under some consumptions, each segment can have, say, a fair price, in the sense it's fair that it's proportional to the income or to the wealth. But this is not always so, because sometimes it has been found that countries where is a kind of very high concentration of income, so a small group of elite of very wealthy people, and the majority of people is poor, then they can, and although on average they can be poorer than some other country, they may get a higher price, because for profit maximization, the best strategy for the monopolist is to charge a very high price in just to get the money from the very few rich people, and just ignore, you know, and outprice the majority of the population. So in some cases there is no clear correlation between the price and the average income of the market or group. Well, Ramsey pricing, we have already spoken a little bit. It means setting prices inversely related to price elasticity, and this is basically meant as originally, at least, later have been other modalities and applications, but originally was meant to say, well, we have a kind of monopoly of utilities, a utility in the sense of gas, electricity, water, etc. And then this requires high investments, and we have decreasing marginal cost. And then the idea is how we set the prices, and just to recover also the sunk or the fixed cost. And again, this is not always consistent with an idea of equity, meaning price related to income or capacity, but still. No? So going a little bit more in practice, differential prices has been used for many years by multinational companies as a kind of voluntary strategy to maximize profits. I think this was quite clear in Europe some years ago before we entered the European the European Union, and then barriers were more or less removed, tariff barriers, and it was quite clear that we had lower prices in the south. For instance, in Portugal, Spain, Greece, we had for the very same product supplied by the same company, we had the lower prices. Certainly it was not a pure model because it was also influenced by the regulators. Here in the south, regulators meant, well, we are poorer country, so we'll try to get to force lower maximum prices. But at least the fact is that companies accepted it. They say, okay, no, as long as in these southern countries the price still is higher than the marginal cost, we add to our profit, and it is much better than to try to charge the same price to all countries. Then also this has been used, differential prices, as a strategy, as a corporate social responsibility. Ya, 5 minutos, hostia. ¿Cómo se dice en inglés para que lo entiendan? my God, no, esto no suena tan mal, ¿no? Seguro. Bueno, well, so companies have also used this approach as a kind of more social responsibility approach. At some point of time in 2001, it was the WHO, in agreement with WTO, World Trade Organization, which tried to sell this strategy, you know, as a kind of a pro-access policy, you know, and they used in that case the term differential pricing, and they tried to convince countries and companies to adopt it. The idea is that, for instance, the pro-access lobby, and by this I mean, I don't know, Médecins Sans Frontières or Oxfam, etc. Initially, they bought the idea, no? But then they have become more and more suspicious because they think that this, at the end, is at the advantage of big pharma. And although at the beginning, you know, for instance, Doctors Without Borders endorsed this idea, now the position is say, well, this is not good because then we, ¿cómo se dice marear la perdiz in English? We take the focus out of the real long-term solutions. No? How you say? So they are quite critical, no? And now there is also a strong campaign of all pro-access people because there is a kind of new trend to set differential pricing, and they say no, better to use compulsory licensing and competition, generic competition. So this is because they fear that they will weaken the support for more, you know, for what they feel it's more stable and sustainable in the long run possibilities. Well, then Danson and Taus and also Danson and Taus and Mestre have made some contributions and proposed some models, but I have no time, so you will have to explain it yourself if you think it's important. It's important also to see that differential pricing occurs also within the countries. This is a very interesting graph from Stephen Sondelmeyer, which has been quoted several times, and it is that even in the United States, where the pharmaceutical market is the most private type of market, no, in the world, you have big differences, no. So if you take the highest price, which is the catalog price of the companies as 100, you have then the Veterans Administration, which has a very good procurement strategies, paying almost half of it, no? And in the middle you have. This has nothing to do with equity. Here usually, if you are poor, you pay the highest price. If you are a little richer and you are insured, then you get a lower price. If you have been in Vietnam and are a veteran, you pay the lowest price. But there is not a real kind of equity reason. No? Well, what we have seen is different studies have seen that any kind of equitable pricing has not been very successful, because if you look at international differences in prices, you see that the economic gradient is quite small. So some studies find that the price of drugs, of the same drugs, are a little higher in countries with higher income per capita. But this is not, explains not a lot of the variation. So the fact you could say is that it doesn't seem to be a clear relationship between the price and the income of a country. This is actually it's difficult to find evidence of this relationship, because especially now, first the differential policies, differential pricing policies are difficult to say exactly where they started to be set and how intense they were. But then also the prices are becoming more and more obscure, no, overall. So now every company tries to sell at confidential price. Governments accept, say, well, okay, if you make me a 50% discount, I will not tell anyone, so they cannot copy, etc. And so you are not sure when you see the results, or even of some empirical analysis, if the relationship you find, it means something really in terms of transaction prices, or it's just in terms of these, hypothetical official prices. And also with the IMS, which is the most frequent used source, you have also some problems. No, I think I will not go in detail, but for instance, if you use IMS data, you are not allowed of criticizing or showing that the data are wrong. So you must believe they are right and okay, and this is supposed to be science, no, etc. Well, let's try then to go. There is some evidence, but I will skip this. You will be able to look at this later, because I have 1 minute. Okay. Let's skip the evidence and let's go to the conclusions and some proposal. It's difficult to assess the validity of studies, because what I just have said, information on prices is usually biased, and we don't know if the price we get in a catalog, at least it's a real price or not. No? and this is a kind of demand we should do, not only as researchers, but also as citizens, no? Because if you don't know the prices of things, how can a market system work? The market is supposed to be based on price, which is a sign, no, for the consumer to say, well, this is cheaper, then I buy it, no? And also the producer say, well, this is high price, let's produce this because it's prospect, no? But also for other purposes, no, for the purpose of accountability, no? So if you have, for instance, a manager and you don't know which price they are paying, so they can get half of the money in his or her pocket, and you cannot know, no? So I think this is really a worrying, development. Also, I am a little concerned about some of the proposals which I have not time to criticize, by Adrian and others, which try to base the idea of different prices in terms of willingness to pay. I think here is a kind of contradiction. So if you try to set differential prices for equity and for access, equitable access, then I think using concepts based on willingness to pay, because willingness to pay is higher if you are richer. No? So I think that maybe then you can later explain what is your thinking about behind this. Well, I will tell you that in principle, differential pricing is not, in my opinion, the best long-term option for a sustainable access. I think there are these proposals of trying to find new ways to incentivize research based on separating, delinking the price of the goods from the innovation incentives and giving what they call prices, but with set, so prices, and paying directly for innovation, and then letting the production work under competition. But I think that there is still a possibility to be used differential or equity pricing, because all these goods which are already produced and patented, I don't think that one can go back and say, well, now we take you all the patents out, and then we do some other kind of you know, incentive architecture. So I think that probably a kind of agreed and fair price structure could be reached. And I will go to some kind of proposal to be a little more provocative. I think this kind of arrangement should be based on these two principles. I don't know if you agree, but the idea is that biomedical innovation is a global public good. If we have it here, there is no problem of anyone else using it, and it will have no cost to pass, not the products, but the information. No? And then the second, in this value judgment, is that the cost of innovation to get this public good should be shared somehow equitably, between all the beneficiaries. So if all the countries of the world are going to use the results of R&D, for fairness, we should expect anyone to pay according to the wealth, possibilities, or whatever. No? So this would be a nice way. We think that countries could agree and some kind of, global, architecture. But this probably doesn't happen. So here is my last advice for a small country which is waiting years and years that they get some fair prices, and they cannot. So what could this middle or low-income country do? So in absence of international consensus, then, well, what I say is you can, I have invented this long name, value budget-based and income-adjusted external reference pricing approach. No? So at that time, they have fired me already. So the idea is, okay, use a basket of countries, but don't use, as most countries do, they use the basket, they put countries in the area, which don't know how to set prices, which they use among them the same, one reference to each other. So no, look at countries that have a kind of rational way, value-based pricing or whatever, which is transparent. Then, for instance, I say UK, nice, Canada, Australia, etc. Then you request an affidavit, so a kind of written statement of what are your transaction prices of a company which is asking for a price in your country. You ask, well, what is the price? And if you tell me a lie, you can go to prison or have being fined. So you get from this official list two real prices. And then you cross-check if you can. Don't trust even if they swore that they say the truth, but you can cross-check. And then you take this average, the average of this basket, and you adjust it by, I don't know, purchasing power parity or whatever, or relative income per capita. So you make a kind of income adjustment, but based on the prices of, reliable, prices set with some clear and transparent. I think that's all. No, let's forget about more sophisticated. Sorry if I've taken more than needed. So thank you.
Thank you, Joao, for being provocative as usual. So let's pass the word to Adam Toles.
So thank you very much for the invitation, and thank you, Juan, for getting us going with some thought-provoking comments. So what I'm going to do is just start by saying a little bit about differential pricing and external reference pricing, and then the relationship between them and whether they're complements or substitutes. And then come on to this question of how do we relate the use of reference pricing with the use of cost effectiveness. So if we're trying to look at cost effectiveness of treatments and doing local value assessments, then how does that relate to importing a price from another country? And then a few concluding thoughts. So, differential pricing. So the two definitions here, I think, reflect some of the points Juan was making. So the economic view, second best efficient way of paying for pharmaceutical R&D by pricing according to willingness to pay. But we can also think of it as a form of equity pricing with appropriate socioeconomic adjustments, and that's taken from a nice paper which Juan also mentioned from YADAF, which was commissioned by the UK Department for International Development. An external reference pricing using the price of medicine in one or several countries in order to derive a benchmark of setting or negotiating price in a given country, which you're familiar with. So, as Juan said, I won't repeat this, a classic case where third-degree price discrimination is likely to increase access, but also potentially increase returns to research and be consistent with equity norms, providing elasticities are related to income. And of course, we can think of other sectors where that may not be the case, but this is one where we may expect there to be some relationship. So there are 5 different approaches or ways in which one could think about implementing differential pricing. This is taken from a paper that I wrote with a couple of colleagues that's coming out in a special issue of the International Journal of Economics and Business, which is it's a supplement to celebrate 50 years of Bill Comenar, who wrote his first papers when he was studying at the LSE in the early 1960s and is now still writing papers. So I'm going to say a little bit about value-based differential pricing in a moment. Juan covered Ramsey pricing, which is the textbook standard way of thinking about third-degree price discrimination. But it's worth just mentioning these other 3 approaches. So two-part pricing has been proposed by several academics in the US, Lachdwala and Seward, Thomas Phillipson, and others. And the essence there is that you're pricing at marginal cost to the patient. There's a co-pay linked to marginal cost of the drug, and then the payer is topping that up with some contribution towards R&D. Unclear to me how easy it is to calculate those payments. Patent buyouts is a variant of the two-part tariff, and it's Juan mentioned it in the context of his final couple of slides as a mechanism for delinkage, which we can, I'm sure, debate in the session. But the key point is that you've got a way of differentiating because you've got a different way of paying for the R&D through some contributions to the patent buyout, and then the product is supplied at marginal cost to the users. And Bill Comenar proposed in an article in Health Affairs a couple of years ago an adaptation of the peak load pricing model, which we typically see in utilities, where in effect the peak load, the capacity payment, comes from higher income countries, and the lower income countries pay the off-peak price, as it were, which is related to marginal cost. I think the problem with some of these approaches is the biggest challenge we face is understanding what pricing should be in middle-income countries, where there should be, in principle, some contribution towards global recovery and global R&D costs, but clearly not the same as in high-income countries, and not the situation in low-income countries where we would expect prices to be close to marginal costs. So I think that's the fundamental challenge, and I think a variant of that, which again we can debate in the Q&A after our presentations, is almost the need for differential pricing within countries. So particularly in middle-income countries that don't have comprehensive universal health coverage, then you're likely to have 2 starkly different markets within those countries. Relatively rich people who are paying out of pocket, and much larger groups of poorer people who may also be paying out of pocket, or may be part of a much more limited public insurance system. So very briefly on value-based differential pricing, which is a paper that Patricia Jorge Mestre Ferrandiz and I published a couple of years ago. And what the principles that we base this on a nice paper by Garber and Phelps, which tries to derive cost-effectiveness analysis principles from welfare economics. And they're essentially looking at how individuals who are choosing to split their income between different goods and services, including healthcare, what would they be trying to achieve at the margin over their lifetime? And that effectively, their willingness to buy health at the margin is their cost-effectiveness ratio, their willingness to buy, to pay for a QALY by spending on health care as opposed to spending their money on other things. And the critical point we're making then is that we can think of healthcare payers, healthcare insurance systems, whether they're publicly or privately funded. They have a set of taxpayers, enrollees, insurees, and what they're trying to do in principle should be to approximate to what Garber and Phelps solved for the individual, where effectively they're trying to set willingness to pay for health gain at the margin for their enrollees linked to their enrollees' willingness to pay, which should in turn impact on their contributions through taxation or through insurance premiums, depending on whether it's a public or private system, towards financing healthcare. We might expect those willingness to pay thresholds as cost-effectiveness thresholds to differ according to income. We'd expect per capita income of the enrollees to be the biggest single driver, but there may also be significant preferences between population groups for spending on health as compared to other goods. We then expect drugs to be priced to meet the threshold, and what we demonstrate is that the resulting price differentials may be within countries between different groups of payers. For example, in a system in the US where coverage is different, but we're really talking about differentials across countries where they typically have some form of single-payer system within a universal health coverage system. And we argue that those prices are likely to be consistent with second-best static and dynamic efficiency. And of course, it's second-best because we're pricing above marginal cost in order to recover R&D, but we're trying to make sure that we get the optimal use of existing products as close as we can, and that we're raising globally the optimal amount of R&D through the signals that are coming to innovators from the prices that payers are willing to pay for health gain. So essentially what we're arguing is what happens to drugs and drug pricing and innovation should be driven by the signals that insurance schemes, publicly or privately funded, are sending about their willingness to pay for health gain. How much do we want for health gain today and tomorrow? And that, by implication, should be signaling to companies about the sort of research, the sort of drugs that people are willing to pay for, the sort of diseases that they want tackling. So I talked briefly about going back to the five. I just want to say that there are important differences between them as to whether they're achieving first or second best efficiency. And a key point is whether they're enabling the company to earn a normal return on R&D investment, or whether they're enabling the company to earn the social surplus during the period of patent protection. So approaches 1, 4, and 5, Ramsey pricing, patent buyouts, and adaptation of peak load pricing, we're essentially trying to give a normally adjusted return on innovation, whereas the value-based pricing and the two-part pricing structure are essentially trying to enable innovators to capture the social surplus during the period of patent protection. And of course that should lead to a degree of entry, and there was a nice paper in one of the sessions yesterday looking at the impact of incremental innovation, i.e. entry on the returns to the breakthrough innovations. So there are clearly differences in what they're trying to accomplish, and of course radical differences in their practical complexity and political feasibility. So moving on very quickly to external reference pricing. 23 out of 31 members of the European Union use reference pricing, and I'm sure Panos is going to go into the issues that raises in more detail. 24 out of 30 OECD countries also use external referencing pricing. The methods and the calculations are often not clear and do vary quite considerably across countries. European countries tend to reference economically similar or geographically close countries, but there are still some issues largely linked to the fact that they very often want to look at the lowest price in the basket. But there are quite substantial differences of the principles that are used. And here's one of, I'm sure you've seen these illustrative diagrams before. This one's taken from a WHO, WTO report showing some of the linkages that take place. So moving on then to the sort of second element, which is there a tension between differential pricing and external reference pricing? So when can they work together, and when do they work in opposition? So there could be a complement where, in effect, we're able to segment the international pharmaceutical market because we've got countries with similar circumstances that we would expect in a differential pricing environment to be making similar contributions towards R&D costs, which may range right down in the case of low-income countries to no contribution where they're paying marginal cost. So if the external reference groups capture countries where we would expect the differential pricing to be similar, then in effect they are their complements. And I've set out here some of the factors that we might expect to influence that, particularly income per capita, which we would expect to be one of the key drivers of differential pricing. So when external referencing procedures are transparent and predictable, then in principle they're creating company-country mutual confident environment supporting, we call, a fair non-strategic decision-making. So we can see a situation in which external referencing becomes a relatively efficient way of implementing differential pricing. However, to the extent external reference pricing uses drug prices elsewhere, it could have the opposite effect where countries are referencing other reference prices from countries that have very different per capita income and by implication very different willingness to pay for pharmaceuticals. So if the differential pricing, people are picking reference pricing from different levels, as it were, within the hierarchy, then we would expect to see a very substantial tension, and they become alternatives or substitutes rather than complements. And some of the things we might see: companies being reluctant to offer low prices to low and middle income countries because they're worried that high income countries are then going to reference those prices and they won't be able to get an appropriate return on innovation. That would then discourage companies from investing in innovation. And it will also lead to long delays in low-income country markets, or indeed a reluctance to launch at any point over the life cycle of the product. And in a worst case, the misuse of external reference pricing could lead to price convergence, a reluctance of companies to introduce any differential pricing at all, an insistence on a single price, which would be inefficient both in terms of the returns to R&D that they would get, the dynamically inefficient, but much more importantly in the short run, it would lead to substantial numbers of patients in low-income countries not getting access to treatments. So if we think about the complements versus substitutes argument, then when external reference pricing is used to similar or comparable countries, or there's an appropriate adjustment, then we might see it as a way of facilitating appropriate levels of differential pricing. But when it's applied with a degree of opaqueness and with the threat of strategic pricing, it encourages strategic behavior on the part of both the countries and companies. And a key issue here is the inclusion of prices of low and middle income countries into higher income country reference baskets. But it's not simply that, as I'm going to come on to in a moment. Time. Just to come on to some illustrations, and I've got an illustration from the EU. I don't want to anticipate too much what Panos is going to say. It's really for illustrative purposes. But a majority of countries within the EU use either the average or the minimum price from a set of reference countries, and I want to show you in just a minute what that looks like. But the paper that number of you will have seen presented by Juan in a session yesterday that's forthcoming, shows there's no evidence at the moment of high-income countries including low-income country prices in their reference baskets. But there are significant income level differences across countries referenced by high-income countries. So in a sense, we seem to have what their paper suggests is that within the bands of high, middle, low-income countries, there's a certain amount of referencing between them, but not across the levels of different hierarchies. So in that sense, you might expect that the bands of differential pricing could be sustained, and we might expect that in that context, external reference pricing becomes a complement to differential pricing rather than a substitute. But I think there are two potential tensions here. The first is that within those groups, and this is just an example that my colleague Michael Bedud put together for me of some countries within the European Union, all classified as high-income countries, but very substantial GDP per capita differences between them. And you see here some of the difference between the highest and the lowest income countries, and you can see some very substantial differences. Let's take Spain's referencing includes countries. The lowest country has a GDP per capita of half of Spain's, and then you look at the rules that are being applied, and very often those low-priced countries are included in baskets of the driver. For example, again, I'll use this for illustrative purposes, Spain. So again, you can see even within the EU, where in principle they're all similar sorts of countries in terms of how we might classify, there are significant differences in income per capita. We might therefore expect it to be efficient to have different prices in those countries. And what we see is an element of reference pricing within Europe, where higher income countries are referencing lower income countries within the European Union. And I think the issue then is that and I think this is, again, is something we can discuss in the session, is that even though Juan and his colleagues show very clearly that the evidence that particularly high-income countries are not referencing low-income countries, there clearly is both an element of referencing within those groups that's having an impact on the strategic behavior of companies, and it's also very important that companies have confidence that high-income countries are not at any point going to reference low-income countries. And that was one of the, Juan referred to a couple of the dialogues that have been set up over the last few years, part of which has been trying to get commitments from high-income countries that they would not reference at any point low-income countries. So part of the issue, even in the absence of high-income countries referencing prices of low and middle-income countries, is having enough confidence that they're not behaving strategically in anticipation of that happening, which can lead to delayed access in low and middle income countries and affordability issues, a reluctance to reduce price towards marginal cost. So you can see companies' strategic behavior here, but we can also think of country strategic behavior. So when a country like the UK, for example, is offering confidential discounts to companies, it's behaving strategically. Why is it willing to offer confidential discounts, or why are companies willing to offer discounts if they're kept confidential? Because the UK list price is used for referencing by other countries. So we have a situation in which the interplay of referencing, where in effect countries and companies know that the external reference pricing system is not working properly, then what we see is strategic behavior by both the companies and the countries, because it's in their interest to do local deals that are hidden, that don't interfere with prices elsewhere. So what we observe in both company strategic behavior and country strategic behavior is the external symptom that the reference pricing process is not working efficiently and isn't at the moment acting as a complement to the sorts of differential pricing that we might regard as an efficient way of trying to trade off and ensure we have as much access as possible to drugs, but also that companies recover their R&D efficiently. What am I doing for time? So final section then is to try and think about external referencing and cost effectiveness. So differential pricing, I've argued, is an effective way to achieve second best static and dynamic efficiency, and we can come on again to discuss some of plans ideas for delinkage as a potentially a more efficient way, but for me, this is the most effective way to get to combine access and returns to R&D. But there are difficulties on having an appropriate implementable mechanism for differential pricing. Low and middle income countries, for obvious reasons, given very limited capacity, both to administer, calculate prices, and also to undertake health economic evaluations, find external reference pricing a relatively simple mechanism to constrain pricing. But there is potential for inefficiencies, which can ultimately lead to companies not willing to offer low and middle income countries appropriately low prices, or indeed a reluctance to launch their products at all. So the question then is, can we develop a form of reference pricing that improves on the most common methods of external reference pricing? So can we devise reference pricing rules that mean that it's complementary to the sorts of differential pricing that we might expect to see? So the external reference pricing rules are clearly linked to countries that are similar in their per capita income and socioeconomic status and type of health system. But I think the other issue is, well, what's the role of economic evaluation and HTA in low and middle income countries? And we already see in a number of middle income countries, notably Taiwan, South Korea, Brazil, quite sophisticated HTA systems already operating, and a number of other countries in Asia and Latin America, systems evolving, and a lot of regional collaboration to build capacity and try and improve HTA capability. So how do we have HTA assessment of what is local value? How does that link with our external reference price systems? And I think that's quite an important issue, and I want to come on to that. In this context, we can note there have been a couple of proposals, and I'm going to illustrate. This is Ruth Lopert and colleagues from 2002, essentially saying, well, why don't we just make a per capita adjustment, have an anchor price at some point, and just have a per capita adjustment for prices in other countries. And this is their example. It's very hard to read, but they've taken an ACE inhibitor, and they've used Australia as the anchor price, and then pro-ratering by PPP adjusted GDP, then you get these prices, and then you can see here if you were able to read it, you could see here what the actual prices they observed, list prices in those countries. And more recently, Ruth did this exercise for a NICE report in pharmaceutical reform in Romania that attached a great degree of controversy. But I think we need to be a little bit cautious, because anchoring the price somewhere and just making some adjustments in the hopes that that's then going to give us a price that's appropriately cost effective in a local context, it's not quite the same as what I was arguing for a systems based on value-based differential pricing, because of course there's a number of other factors in here, particularly what is the local willingness to pay, and what is the comparator, and what are the costs elsewhere in the system. So we have to, if we're just pro rata adjusting prices, we have to assume that the threshold is the same across these countries, the comparator is the same, the costs of running the health system, costs of a hospital day, whatever, are the same. Because if they're not, then pro-ratering the price is not the same as pro-ratering the value. And again, to just reiterate those points, and more generally, we'd expect to see a relationship between pharmaceutical price differences and per capita GDP. It's not a pro rata relationship if we're trying to, as I would argue, go for something that's a much more of a proxy of what I've called value-based differential pricing, where we're looking at local willingness to pay for health gain. Per capita income, it's not a one-to-one relationship. We need to take into account, as I mentioned, the net cost impact. Of course, we need to bear in mind that companies will not price below marginal cost, and of course that's true whether we're talking about an innovative company or a generic manufacturer. So, final slide. So the relative simplicity of using external reference pricing is becoming more widespread, but there is a key issue as to whether whether the countries that are included in the ERP are appropriately referenced. If they are, then this can be external reference pricing can be a very powerful complement to trying to implement differential pricing and get the returns to R&D to reflect particularly differential income per capita, but also other local circumstances. If not, then we're likely to see a continuation of the sort of strategic behavior we're seeing on the part of companies and countries, which effectively is trying to achieve differential pricing, but in a way that is not consistent with efficient external reference pricing. I've showed you Lopet et al. Proposing a mechanism adjusting prices, finding an anchor price and then adjusting that by GDP per capita purchasing power parity. And that's not quite the same as the proposal that I'm making, where we're interested in value-based differential pricing, where we're trying to understand what is local willingness to pay for health gain. And I think we have a crucial issue, I think, particularly in middle and low-income countries that are trying to use HTA and think through how they make value assessments of what is the most efficient way of combining reference pricing, some sort of understanding of local value, in such a way that we have a value-based local pricing that is efficient and recognises the constraints on HTA capacity and the other challenges of calculating cost effectiveness in a number of low-income healthcare systems. So lots for debate, I hope. Thank you.
Thank you, Adrian, for being kind, and especially thank you for your clear presentation. And now Panos Canavos, he's going to introduce the same topics around Europe, and we're going to speak about parallel trade. So,
okay, very good.
Thank you,
How do we get there? Okay, that's Adrian. Okay, so whilst Jaime is getting ready, I would like to thank, of course, Jaime and the school here for the very kind invitation, and thank you very much. Of course, when you come last in a series of very eminent speakers, then there's obviously there's good news and bad news. The good news is that there's an awful lot of redundancy in the last presentation in a very confined topic such as external price referencing, differential pricing, and the implications. So that makes my job here a little bit easier in terms of length of presentation. The bad news, of course, is that sometimes the audience is a little bit tired with so much informational overload. So I'll try and be both brief, succinct, but also very strategic in the kind of things that I'm going to talk about. And the agenda that I have in mind is go briefly through the kind of regulation that we have in mind with external price referencing, the key issues in the difference across systems of external price referencing, some of the unwanted effects of external price referencing, and putting these into the context that Adrian mentioned earlier on in terms of, for example, differential pricing and external price referencing acting as complements or substitutes. I would argue that the evidence that we have points to the latter rather than the former. So the question is then how do we get these two to work as complements? And seeking potentially suitable alternatives from a political standpoint, not only from an economic standpoint. I think we had both Joan and Adrian outline some of the alternatives that have been proposed in the literature. But I wanted to highlight a little bit some of the work that we are currently doing on best practice principles, but also talk about the impact that external price referencing and differential pricing have had in Europe from the point of view of cross-border trade. Okay, I'll go through very quickly some of the initial slides. I think this is a citation from the WHO HAI working paper on external price referencing. Both Jaime and Joan have contributed to that. It's a definition of external price referencing. I think we know quite reasonably what external price referencing is, and of course what the implications are in terms of referencing countries. The question of course becomes which countries. The principle and the philosophy of external referencing are very simple. Essentially you select a basket of countries and you take a reference from there, whether it is the average or it is the lowest. What is important of course to remember is really, and that has implications for the kind of spillover effects that external referencing has more broadly outside the jurisdiction in which it is intended. So for example, you can see countries like Belgium or the UK or Spain being referenced in other jurisdictions. And that goes back to Adrian's point about strategic behavior, both of companies but also of countries. And we'll see what the interaction is of these later on in the European context. So very frequently we are talking about external price referencing as a simple mechanism. In fact, the philosophy is extremely simple. In practice, however, the practicalities point to a slightly different reality. And here we've got a set of fairly complex systems, external price referencing systems, not only from a European perspective, but from an international perspective. And here are some of the peculiarities that point to or increase, in fact, the complexity. For example, the choice of basket countries. So how many countries do you want to reference? And of course, that increases your cost of compliance as a regulator in a particular jurisdiction. Do you have a large basket, do you have a small basket? And of course, the larger the basket, the more complex the interaction of information, practices, of data acquisition, and so on becomes. So for example, you have small examples of small baskets and examples of large baskets. If you go a little bit outside the European Union, if you go into the Middle East and North Africa, you see even larger baskets. So not only 20, whatever it is, 24, 25 countries out of 28 in the EU that the Czech Republic and Greece are referencing, but for example, in Egypt you have 32 or 35. In India you have other huge numbers of countries. So the choice of basket countries is important. How the external reference, how the external price or the price derived through external referencing is used has momentous implications about both efficiency, about the extent to which we can talk about complementarities versus substitutability between differential pricing and reference pricing. Is it used explicitly? Is it used in price setting, or is it used in price setting as well as reimbursement? Then the complexity becomes even greater. So if it is used explicitly, then obviously it's a mechanism for price setting. That differs quite fundamentally compared with the circumstances when it is used implicitly. For example, if you compare the price setting in Slovakia, that was raised earlier on, or in Greece, or even in Turkey, or in Egypt. In other words, through a mechanism of external price referencing which is repeated and repeated and repeated on an annual basis or a 6-monthly basis, versus an implicit use which is used only at launch. And that has momentous implications also about the evolution of prices, not only at market entry but also beyond market entry. So we have the case there of France, for example, of implicit price, external price referencing use. The application, therefore, of the scheme is also very important, and the extent to which we have fairly frequent updates is influencing the evolution of prices, particularly when different currencies are used. And I'll show you some evidence later on about some of the unwanted effects, if you like, of external price referencing with fairly frequent updates. And of course, the price choice: is it the minimum? Is it the median? Is it the average? Is it some kind of low? What is it? And that has implications also. The selection of basket countries suggests that countries with very frequently fairly high income levels do reference countries with low income levels. And I think this is not a recent development, but I think it has accelerated in the past 3 to 5 years. Also, the circumstance, in other words, the price choice from the basket, from let's say the median or the average towards the lowest, has also accelerated in recent years. That also has a momentous implication in terms of driving the prices towards the bottom. So the kind of issues and the implications that we have with external price referencing relate to how a price is obtained, how are they used, and what prices are we used. Do we use ex-factory prices? Do we use wholesale prices, and so on. Price selection, therefore, is very important. There are situations where regulators are using retail prices to start with, but they have to derive ex-factory prices through some kind of algorithm, and that of course increases both the complexity but also the potential bias and the error that we are subjecting ourselves to. The level of price enforcement, is it, for example, the external price referencing used as a price setting mechanism, or is it a requirement therefore, or is it used as a basis for negotiations? These two are quite different. If it is used as a basis for negotiation, then other tools may apply. But obviously, the lower the lower the market price or the entry price, then obviously the lower the starting point for the negotiation. But you have countries as well where the external price referencing rule is transferred one-to-one into reimbursement, and that also means that very frequently, especially when prices of pharmaceutical products through external referencing are very frequently fictitious, therefore not transactional prices, that many countries may be potentially overpaying, and that's something that we probably need to discuss later on. The kind of products that we include in external referencing, and of course the frequency and approaches to price revisions, and obviously also clauses in legislation about the use of exchange rates and what type of exchange rates, and whether it is the actual exchange rate or the or some kind of moving average over the previous 1 or 2 or 3 years, and so on and so forth. All these quite frequently affect the way that the average or the median or the lowest price in a particular country through EPR actually is. Some of the undesired effects of external price referencing. The first one is obviously, and looking at it also from the perspective of differential pricing, is that the prices derived are very frequently not real prices, because we also take into account list prices. List prices are not necessarily transactional prices, and I think either Joan or Adrian mentioned earlier on that we do have significant discounting taking place, particularly for new products, and the level of discounting is quite significant. So therefore, if there is a list price which a country derives from 3 or 4 or 20 others and doesn't take into account discounts, and obviously if that price is transferred one-to-one into a coverage decision or a reimbursement decision, then obviously that country may be overpaid, whether it is of high or low income. Launch delays, and I'll show you some evidence about potential launch delays in a number of countries that we studied a few years ago. The exchange rate volatility impact, and of course the issue of cascading and the way that external price referencing cascades across settings and across jurisdictions, and the likely implications that this may have. Here is the likely effect of external price referencing on prices and products launch and launch delays. This was actually done in 2009 and 10. Jaime was a co-author on this one. This was done. It was a study for the European Commission under a project that we had at the time, and we inquired in a number of Central and Eastern European countries. We still cannot reveal the names of countries here, but if you study their features of external price referencing, I think it may be relatively clear which these countries are. These are the number of products we studied 11 products, high-end products, immunomodulators, cancer products, and so on. These were the number of products on the market, so 11, and you can see what happened from a market entry perspective. This is the number of products in reimbursement. So in some cases, for example, in this particular country, we had 7 products on the market and 6 on reimbursement. In this case, we had 6 on the market and 4 on reimbursement. And you can see here on the last column the average delay in terms of negotiating access, negotiating reimbursement. So it goes in from 96 days here to over 700 days somewhere here. and of course it was greater. So there are some significant, potential significant effects. So I think the way that external price referencing is implemented has some implications about the possibility of launch delays from a manufacturer's perspective, but also from a regulatory perspective in terms of behavior of a particular healthcare system towards launching a product or a list or a set of products with particular pricing characteristics. Here is the effect of external exchange rate volatility on prices, and in particular on the price of a particular country, and that's the Czech Republic, where we studied the effect of market entry of a new product set at a price which is, in this particular example, 10 euros, and looking at what happened in the basket of countries that the Czech Republic was taking as reference, and the basket of currencies. And if we have a significant depreciation of currencies, as was the case, so you can see some appreciation of some benchmark currencies here, and a subsequent depreciation over a 18-month period, we found that the overall depreciation would be in the region of 20 to 25%. So you have purely isolating the effect of price revisions. If you take those price revisions at the point in time they need to take place, the price decline would be, compared with market entry at T plus 18 months, would be about 26%, so minus 26%. I think this is another way of showing what Adrian showed earlier on, the cascade effects of the international implications. And it goes without saying that many developing countries or emerging countries are taking into account prices in developed countries, but there's also a phenomenon whereby low-income countries are referencing developing countries, and we've heard that in Saudi, we've heard that in Egypt, we've heard that very recently in other parts of the developing world as well. So we must not, therefore, underestimate the impact that this strategic behavior by countries, what kind of strategic behavior it instigates on behalf of companies and manufacturers. So what's the overall effect of external price referencing? Because of the way it is designed, we are observing a race towards the lowest, towards the bottom. I think this is one of the empirical, let's say, conclusions that we have at least from a European standpoint. Big question: does it constitute efficient regulation, and if so, for which countries? And this is one of the areas where we probably have lower income countries not necessarily benefiting from this type of regulatory behavior. So it is really the losers, I would argue, of external price referencing would be those countries which are lower income countries. Should we worry about it? Well, one of the ways that we thought it might be a reasonable idea to, if you like, promote a more efficient use of our resources, and therefore promote external price referencing, because it's not going to go away. Regulators like it. It is, in principle, a reasonable idea, only if it could work under the circumstances of set principles that a number of regulators could agree to. And that points to some work that we are currently doing on best practice principles. In other words, how should we implement an external price referencing system that practically addresses some of the peculiarities we saw earlier on, some of the exchange rate effects, some of the race towards the bottom, some of the selection of lower income countries from higher income countries, and so on and so forth. And of course, the expected benefits, if we come up with a structure of external price referencing that meets certain requirements, could promote the idea of differential pricing and external price referencing working together, and therefore promote, in other words, the idea of complementarity rather than substitutability that was mentioned earlier on. So we could improve transparency, we could reduce the likelihood of abuse of monopolistic, if you like, power by governments, and so on and so forth. The kind of principles that we had in mind relate to certain headlines. The first headline, if you like, were the objectives and the scope of external price referencing system. For example, just to go very quickly, the objective of the system should be clear and harmonized with health system objectives and reviewed periodically. So fair prices for new health technologies, fairness and equal access to healthcare interventions. The focus, if we look at another principle of the system, should be on in-patent products considered for the purpose of pricing and reimbursement or coverage decisions, because in many settings we have observed the effect of patent expiry in one jurisdiction and generic entry is automatically being considered as a new price, particularly generic entry at -40 or -50 or -60% as a new price in a different jurisdiction. So therefore, the issue of patentability should be observed. The prices developed using external references should not override conclusions of HTAs or value-based pricing approach. So simple, in a sense, guiding principles from objectives and scope of EPR systems. In terms of administration and operation, we should keep it administratively simple. The stakeholders should participate. The stakeholders could have the right to appeal. The reference country should be selected based on similarities in economic status. So in other words, elements that do not kind of deviate from the kind of behavior, or rather deviate from the kind of behavior that we have been observing over the past several years. And the international implications of external price referencing implementation should also be considered. In terms of methods, that's another major heading for the conduct of external price referencing. So we're looking at ex-factory prices. The mean of prices could be used. The patent status is to be respected, and as much as possible avoid the effect of exchange rate volatility. This is something that we have seen in legislation in some countries. For example, in Turkey we use a kind of market exchange rate, and there were thoughts to introduce a moving average, which of course has not been implemented, and similar arrangements in other settings. And finally, in terms of implementation, the price revision should be kept at minimum. Another scenario would be to consider external referencing at launch, and some of those external based prices to be aligned with other tools for negotiating reimbursement. So there is obviously consider here the distinction between price setting and reimbursement. Okay. So let's come to price differentiation here. Wouldn't price differentiation be, if you look at it from a European standpoint, a more efficient strategy? Not least because we do have significant differences across countries, and I think the argument has been pushed. But look, consider this. Consider the significant income disparities between EU member states. I think some of those income disparities may have changed compared to 2010-11, as you see them here. So some countries may have gone up, some countries may have gone down. So there may be a sort of 12 to 14, maybe as far as 17 time difference between per capita incomes across the member states. At best, ×2 difference in prices. Nowadays, even lower. For some of the newer products, even lower price differences. So it is almost a misnomer. So it effectively penalizes some of the lower income settings or income countries within our region. The big question is, also from a policy standpoint, whether there is in fact any traction, any appetite, if you like, for higher income countries to pay significantly more than lower income countries. Could we, as a recent proposal was put forward, group countries by income and therefore set external price referencing according to groups? Can we protect that? Okay. But in return, would we be able, or would we want to consider EU-wide an EU-wide policy on drug pricing regulation? Because putting or agreeing on certain countries to be placed in groups so that a particular reference group benefits from from certain arrangements would actually imply some kind of EU price regulation. And of course, the big issue is how do we deal with regional exhaustion of intellectual property rights? In other words, how do we deal with the effect of cross-border trade? So if we accept that there are significant income differences, if we accept therefore that some of these income differences may translate into significant differences in prices, how do we hedge against cross-border trade in a continent or in a union that promotes the freedom in the movement of goods? And the economic outcome in this particular case, if we consider the case of parallel trade, is that eventually there will be a race towards the top. Let's see that in a sort of a game theoretic approach, where the export price in a low price country, and we consider that to be price A, then becomes price B if we take into consideration the transaction cost that a parallel importer incurs. Okay, and that is the minimum parallel trade price in the importing country. And if we consider Z to be the price of the locally sourced product in the destination country, in the import country, then the parallel trader has the possibility, so to speak, to make zero profits at B, to move into a price X, which is below the the locally sourced price, or to basically meet the locally sourced equivalent at price Z. Okay. The pricing strategies for locally sourced and parallel trade product are shown in here. So the locally sourced product has the possibility, upon entry of a direct competitor from another setting, parallel setting, has the opportunity to either stay at Z or reduce at X, or even meet the parallel importer if the parallel importer price is at B. The only, if you like, viable or feasible Nash equilibrium from this kind of behavior here, this kind of game, is that both the parallel trader but also the locally sourced product stay at Z. In circumstances where there isn't an inducement or a parallel trade inducement incentive on behalf of governments or health insurers. So let's see that. So the parallel trade, in the absence of parallel trade enabling policy and clawbacks, the only feasible outcome for the parallel traded product is to be priced at Z, and therefore meet the locally sourced equivalent. You may have circumstances where there are parallel trade enabling policies. So for example, we did have that, we still do, in some jurisdictions where the price difference is shared between health insurer and the distribution chain. So you may have therefore price spread sharing, co-payments, or even quotas. And in those circumstances, the price of the parallel trader will have to be slightly below the price of the locally sourced equivalent. The locally sourced equivalent will not going to go below Z, which is the fixed, if you like, price in the destination country. And of course, you may have a scenario where parallel trade may take place in the context of genericization. And in this particular setting, the parallel traded product is more likely to compete at the price which is closer to the generic equivalent. And have we seen that kind of behavior? I think we have all outcomes in different settings. So for example, and this is the evidence that we had from parallel trade in a number of products in Germany. There is some price spread between the originator, the locally sourced originator, and the parallel traded. And of course, and that is because of the incentive structure, incentivizing pharmacies to dispense a particular type of parallel traded, a particular proportion of volume on parallel traded products. And you can see in some products that this price spread becomes enormous compared with previous years. You can see here, if you can see it at the back, 35%, 16%, 21%, compared with, let's say, 9% and so on and so forth. The star here indicates genericization compared with previous circumstances where we have no genericization. Okay? And the same thing in countries like the Netherlands, where the insurer and the distribution, the retail distribution split the difference between originator, locally sourced, and originator parallel traded. You can see, of course, the issue of genericization here for one particular drug. You can also see it here. For the price spread becomes from 7.5% to about 26%, etc., etc. So there are interesting kind of interactions here. In countries like the UK, when the UK was a parallel importer rather than parallel exporter, the price difference between originator, locally sourced, and originator parallel traded was close to zero, or zero in many settings, many cases. Reason was because the game was played at the distribution chain through discounting. There were no explicit, therefore, incentives to price lower versus higher. So the overall impact, therefore, from a parallel trade perspective, again, some welfare reducing effects. Shortages in export countries, okay, small to moderate volumes because of with volatility, so we don't have the massive volume effect that one might expect for arbitrage to take hold and equalize prices. Of course, differential regulation for that purpose. So therefore no constant impact on prices, particularly in destination countries, in import countries. Little, if any, impact of prices if no parallel trade enhancement measures or strategies are implemented in imported countries. And the economic rents accrue to a little bit to health insurance, but in most part are lost in the transition from an exporting into an importing country. So back to the question about differential pricing in Europe and if there is traction. Yes, if we can implement an export ban, I think this would be an important consideration here. And yes, if we accept some kind of EU policy on price setting and pricing, which, of course, from a political feasibility perspective, we have to question and discuss because of the resistance of member states, but also because, of course, of subsidiarity. Finally, okay, linking the evidence that we have from the implementation of external referencing systems in Europe, the kind of considerations about differential pricing and the cross-border trade. External referencing is a complicated system. It's not as simple as one thinks from an implementation perspective. But it does. We have evidence that it does lead to a race towards the lowest price. There is increasingly a difference between list and transaction prices, and that forces us, or forces decision makers, to think twice about, baskets, about what strategies to implement for list pricing, but also for coverage decisions and whether additional measures can be implemented there. There are significant international spillover effects of external referencing, and finally. If we are to think very actively about differential pricing in Europe, we cannot implement that without resolving the issue of cross-border trade, one way or the other. I'll stop here. Let's have a discussion. Thank you.
Thank you again to all the speakers for the really interesting presentation. Now is your time, so please wake up. Try to be provocative, Joan, or try to be to make any question that you consider interesting. Yes, please.
Thanks. And my question, because all of you have been talking about said at the beginning about net prices, not list price, because this is the transactional price and so on. So something that you just mentioned very briefly, I think it was your last principle, So I'm thinking about reimbursement agreements once the net price is set in a country. So in some countries, both at national or regional local levels, there are some kind of agreements that makes that the average transactional price is lower than this one that has been set. So you mentioned very briefly, but I haven't seen this consideration in your presentations, and I would like to know how this should be taken into account when setting the net price in this reference pricing for all the countries. Is it clear, the question? Because
I'll give it a
Thank
go, and
you.
maybe Adrian and Joanne may want to chip in. I think there's wide recognition that there is a significant discrepancy, not only in European countries, but increasingly internationally, between what we consider as the list price and what we have as a net price. And that I see as a, if you like, as a de facto implementation of differential pricing, based on ability, willingness to pay, or ability or willingness to negotiate. There's no doubt that compared with where we were 5 years ago, 6 years ago, there are all kinds of agreements, arrangements, and so on. And these arrangements can be of different types. We can debate the effectiveness of these arrangements, the ability to contain costs, the efficiency with which, and so on, and also their transferability, because there are, although many of these agreements are confidential in nature, there are calls for them to become more publicly available. We can also debate how that could happen or should happen. But for sure, external referencing is increasingly taking place with list prices in mind. It is not taking place with net prices in mind. The net price has become the subject of negotiation. I'll stop here.
I would just say really it's a symptom of the fact that, for me, that external reference pricing has become a substitute for differential pricing. So to be blunt, it's just a mess, and I think in the European context, where it's the biggest mess, I think Panos brought that out very clearly. So the reality is we're so far away from a collective government, intergovernment understanding of where the appropriate levels, what is it appropriate for Germany, UK, Spain to be paying for a drug as compared to Greece, Slovakia. Even within Europe, we're so far away from that, that what we're seeing is the unobserved discounts, the difference between list price and transaction price, is just a symptom of that. And until we have more structure and a willingness to collaborate between governments, then what we're going to see is, I hope we'll get some differential pricing, but we're going to see it through confidential processes, which for those who, maybe one of them, who see external reference pricing as a potentially powerful tool, will cause intense frustration, I think. But it's, the system is broken, to be honest, unfortunately, at the moment.
Sorry.
I would say that I mentioned at some point of time that I think that the right way to address the issue is to accept that biomedical innovation in general, is a global public good. And it is clear then a market price does not work. And we are trying to, a market price, or even I would say a decentralized regulation system. And if we don't accept this, okay, then we keep on muddling through and trying to fool each other, and we hide the prices, but then we take the price of other country and reduce it. And so my idea, which I have not invented, but which I found in some countries have introduced, is try to force those that know the real prices to disclose it. And it's by the time they come with the product and try to get a price, you say, well, tell me under a a compromise, a formal compromise with penal or economic responsibilities. What is the transaction price you are having in these countries? You know, and then you must expect that they will not lie to you because they are risking, you know, to make a crime or an offense. And so I think the only way in this decentralized, not cooperative way, you know, then say, well, each country has to do its war to fight its own war. So, you know, then I fight against anyone, you know, trying to fool me by saying you will go to prison if you give me, you know, wrong information.
Can I just come back on this, the point, Han, you make about a global public good and market prices won't work? I think we need to unpick that a bit. So a drug is not a global public good. A drug is consumed by me, I get the benefits. Nothing global or public about that. It's the knowledge that it has global public good characteristics. And acquiring that knowledge involves investing resources, and somehow, in order to make that investment, a return has to come on it. So the question is, how do we do that? And what I've tried to set out in value-based differential pricing is that if you use a patent system to enable the private sector to get a return, then using prices that are linked to local payer willingness to pay is one way of getting market prices that will give a return. So I'm not saying there aren't other ways you can envisage the system, but I don't think that the fact that the R&D knowledge has global public good characteristics means that you can't have a market price system as one mechanism, which I would advocate, one mechanism for making that as second best efficient as possible.
Okay, before the second question, I want to go back to one of the issues that John had been commented, is the issue of getting the real price. In theory, could be easy, but in practice, no, because, I mean, you know, we are playing the game, and sometimes when you ask to the pharma company, say, okay, I'm not giving discount this product, I'm not going to give you discount this product because the headquarters say that I cannot give you, so but I'm going to give you 20% discount in that other product that I don't care anymore. So in this case, when you ask to the manufacturer which discount are you giving to this company, say, okay, we are not giving discount anymore to this product because there is no discount. So it's not easy to get the real price in some cases. So I mean, I agree with you. I mean, confidential agreement is making very difficult to make international reference pricing, but it's more difficult to get real price because the game that we are playing right now is really complex. So second question, please.
James Raftery, University of Southampton. First, thank you for a really interesting outline of the principles and the background. But I'm very struck that there's no mention of the biggest problem, which is the astronomical prices being charged for particular drugs in recent years, particularly cancer drugs, orphan drugs, being priced at levels that will be unaffordable. There are many multiples of GDP per head, and it simply won't work. So I particularly Adrian's view, but also the others, as to what's going on here. Is there assumptions being made that the price in the high-income country, which is the United States, which consumes 50% of global patent drugs, if there's a problem there, and if companies are pricing for that market, and if that market is broken or highly dysfunctional, as seems to be the case, then surely the reference point, the price in the high-income country, is wrong. And all of this is dissolves into strategic behavior. And countries having a race to the bottom makes sense, even as the only way to try and deal with it. So I'd like each of the panel to address the real question. What's happening with the astronomical prices that are being charged for many new drugs?
Shall I go first? I mean, I would argue under the value-based differential pricing approach that I've advocated as being one way to approach differential pricing, then if individual payer systems are setting their willingness to pay for health gain, then that's essentially setting the maximum price that they're willing to pay. But obviously for that system to work, it then means that if companies don't play ball, then essentially the drugs are not available or are targeted, are only available for certain subsets of the population. So the fact that the fact that let's assume that the US system is broken in some way and is not implementing willingness to pay thresholds at pricing. There's no reason why other countries can't do that and signal very clearly that the extent to which they are willing to contribute to the R&D costs of particular types of innovation, which reflect their willingness to pay for that sort of health gain. So I think in part the fact that there are issues in the US market means that certain products exist that we might think have limited benefit, but in a sense other countries should be paying an appropriate amount for that if they think they have limited benefit. And I think so that would be my kind of take on it. But I think the kind of link point is what do we do in low and middle income countries, and an important and a key shift of what's happened in the last 5 years and looking forward at the replacement for the Millennium Development Goals is a greater emphasis on non-communicable disease. So we used to see, particularly in low-income countries, the issue was communicable disease and how do we price drugs for that. Now, increasingly in a number of these countries, then the disease pattern is changing and it's non-communicable disease, and it includes oncology and other areas. So I think this question of how we have systems of differential pricing and countries do get very different prices to US prices becomes even more important. So I've tried to advocate one route that I think in principle could be efficient, but it's not straightforward. But it essentially would involve ignoring the US prices as not being relevant for local pricing.
No, my point of view is that it's not just United States guilty for having a rational system, which is partly I would also agree on this. I think it's actually the point that these incentives for innovators are based on monopolies, on market exclusivity, and I think this is not necessary. I think what is important is that you find ways to reward the innovator, and you must reward the company or the center which invest a big amount of money in developing drugs, but it's not necessarily a monopoly. It can be what they call prices, it could be a royalty, maybe. You could have, as an inventor, you could have 10% of the sales or $1 per each pill or whatever, no? And this would not have the perverse effects that a monopoly has, which sometimes even makes that some company or some innovator finds a new product and is not interested in putting to market or selling, because it would make competition to some previous products. No, is what they call defensive patenting, which I think it's a perversion, because if we, as a society, we have a kind of social contract which gives some rights, a monopoly, to promote innovation, that then companies use this right so to invent something and to keep it out from being used and being innovative. I think we should start thinking that this type of property right has, some perverse effects. No? So the idea is not being against intellectual property rights, but against, in my case, in many other people, against monopolistic property rights, who gives you the right to put, to negotiate the price, whatever the market can bear or the regulator can bear, or even to take this innovation out of, of the domain of the market until the patent has expired.
I think for far too long we have relied on a system that takes innovation for granted, and that's definitely the situation in the United States. So what the manufacturer proposes is give or take, or may give or take be accepted by the insurer, whoever that insurer may be. I think if we accept the monopoly power and therefore monopoly pricing without a means of discussion or based on validated information, we're giving the monopoly the right to charge the highest possible price in the market. I think that has been this has been happening for a very long time. In comes external referencing, and I think this is an incomplete, imperfect, and potentially very inefficient way, because it doesn't it doesn't enable it doesn't enable decision makers to negotiate based on hard facts. So the issue with willingness to pay thresholds, I think, with the willingness to pay thresholds and the use of good information, validated information in health technology assessment, we are getting somewhere, but this is still an incomplete system. And the situation with prices is probably going to get a lot worse if potential cures come to market. So we're going to have to rethink the way we, the kind of information we want to see as decision makers and regulators to form perceptions about what a price should be. We have allowed that to be far too imperfect for far too long. And it hasn't been evidence-based decision making, but with external referencing, for example, it has been relying basically on others to make a decision. With health technology assessment, this is one reasonable way of getting somewhere. It has significant imperfections. So I think the demand side needs to rely on far better information, whether that information means cost of or a value of having some idea about the value of a cure, and how that may affect and what spillover effect it may have on prices of pharmaceutical products which do not necessarily provide a cure. At some point, all these prices may have to go down if we set a limit or a ceiling, if you like, on what we're willing to pay for a cure. On the supply side, we may need to leverage more the intellectual property system. That can be done in a number of ways. I think both Adrian and Joan outline a number of potential solutions. We may need to see the kind of incentives we provide through the patent system. To do what? To do incremental innovation, or to incentivize even more those innovators that bring to market the top end. In other words, the significant improvements in life expectancy, overall survival, if you like, or the cures. So there are two ways. We still have a long way to go in both, I think. But this situation cannot continue. You are right. But on the bright side, you may have seen what has happened with some of the hepatitis C treatments in the developing world. In one or two cases, which I consider to be a deviation from what a standard multinational pharmaceutical manufacturer would do. This is not necessarily the way forward for others, but could provide a very useful way of thinking. The kind of feedback I get from the network that Jaime and I and Joan used to run in Europe is this: why can't we in Europe benefit from the kind of prices that Egypt gets for a Hep C drug? In other words, $1,000 per case, not per pill. But it creates that kind of, let's say, competitive behavior between countries and between nations. So, both on the supply, but also on the demand side.
Okay, thank you. The time is over. I invite you to have a coffee, and probably we can follow the discussion in a very nice place outside. Thank you for coming.